Hello, everybody. I'm Fran Pontash, Viticulture Program Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. I am in the Gulf Coast. We've got everybody here today. You all are on mute. We took a survey of questions, frequently asked questions, and we will be addressing them. Okay, so we're going to go through and introduce ourselves so you know who we are. I'm going to go in order here of the screen and go to Justin.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Justin Shiner. I'm a viticulture specialist with AgriLife Extension. I probably have met most of you on here, maybe not, but I'm located in College Station, and I work most closely with Michael and Fran in the Gulf Coast and North Texas regions.
Michael.
Howdy, my name is Michael Cook, Viticulture Program Specialist for North Texas, based out of Denton. I want to thank everyone for joining in today.
Brianna?
Hi, I'm Bree Crowley. I'm in the Hill Country. I am the Program Specialist for this region, Disease Lady Extraordinaire, lately Bud Cutter Supreme.
Jim?
I'm Jim Comas, Extension Fruit Specialist at the Texas A&M Viticulture and Fruit Lab in Fredericksburg.
Is JC back with us?
I am. I am the program manager for the Viticulture and Sustainable Fruit Applied Research Program, and I'm also in Fredericksburg.
Danny.
Hi everyone, my name is Danny Hill and I'm the program specialist for the High Plains in West Texas. And I'm based in Lubbock and I work with Pierre, mostly.
Pierre?
Well, I'm Pierre Edwy and I am assistant professor and extension specialist. I cover Texas High Plains with Danny.
And Monty Nesbitt.
Yeah, greetings. I'm Monty Nesbitt. I'm actually know zero about grapes. I know what a grapevine is, and I know what grapes look like, but I don't know much about grapes. But I know some things about freeze and frost protection, which is why I think they brought me here today. I'm happy to participate.
Well, very good. Justin Shiner is our first speaker for the day.
Okay. Hello, everyone. We have nearly a couple hundred people in this meeting, and I know there are people from all over the state. And I want to start this with some context. Ultimately, what we're trying to do here is talk about, what to look for in your vineyards, how to assess damage. And then we're going to tell you about what we've seen and what we're hearing from you all in the industry. And it's important for us, especially in Extension, to gather as much information as we can so that we can learn from this event and then share it back with you. These types of freezes, historically they have happened, but they are quite rare. I believe, or at least what I've heard thus far, is that this was the third coldest event that we've had here in Texas. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to look at it, number of hours below freezing and things like that. Record lows. In many cases, we did not actually hit our record lows. I've got that map here on the left for the region. But what made this event so problematic and so unique is that the entire state of Texas was affected. And the last time we had something like this was about 30 years ago in 1989, and we had similar lows. So we hope this doesn't happen, anytime soon, but we want to gather as much information as we can about, what types of damage we're seeing and how serious it was. So we urge you, as you find out in your vineyards, to send us information and let us know. And we're happy to help out where we can. And so I'm going to talk about injury assessment, but I wanted to point out a couple of things about this event that makes it unique to us as an industry, is that we very well may see damage in regions that we're not used to seeing damage from winter injury. So for example, in the Gulf Coast, many people reported 8 to 10 degrees above zero, whereas say in North Texas, a lot of vineyards went down below zero. In the High Plains, that's true as well. But what's interesting is that there's a very good chance that we're going to see as much, if not more, damage in the Gulf Coast than the High Plains or North Texas, even though their temperatures were colder. And so I want to talk a little bit about acclimation and deacclimation and why that may be, why we may see differences based on the region. It's not just a matter of the varieties of grapes that we're growing, but it has a lot to do with the state of the vines. And also would like to point out that in the very far southern part of the Gulf Coast, down in the Rio Grande Valley, technically this event was actually a late spring freeze for some vineyards because they had already broken bud. So for some of us, it was more of a mid to late winter freeze because the vines were fully dormant. And then as you go east and south in the state, it becomes closer to bud break. So there's a potential for more damage due to that. So before we jump into how do you assess damage in your vineyards to the buds, to the wood, I want to just provide some background on acclimation, deacclimation. I know a lot of you have been growing grapes for a while. You've heard this, you've read about this, you're probably quite familiar, but that may not be true for everybody. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here so that when you're out assessing your vineyard and looking around, you can have some context, to understand what's going on. So we'll start with acclimation, which is, simply an increase in cold hardiness or, the ability to withstand cold temperatures. And grapes, they acclimate. We see it in the fall, but the reality is it actually begins somewhere around midsummer, around veraison. The grapes are already starting to prepare for winter. The first really visible signs that this is happening is periderm. So we see the shoots starting to brown towards the base and going out towards the tips. That's telling us the shoots are hardening off. But what's happening inside the vine is that the vine, the woody tissue, including those dormant buds, they're actually starting to store carbohydrates, so sugars and starches that are produced by the leaves. It's going to the fruit, but it's also going to the woody part of the plant. And what we know is that if you have a major stress in the Gulf Coast, one big stress that we have challenges with is a loss of your canopy from downy mildew. It takes more energy to regrow the canopy, and that means less of those carbohydrates go to the wood. And we typically have some cane death after that happens, even in a normal winter. And the reason that is that those carbohydrates, they act as a natural antifreeze. It's similar to, say, salt water. Salt water, doesn't freeze at 32, it freezes at a colder temperature. You can add sugar to water and it's the same thing. So that's one of the ways that the grapes acclimate and prepare for cold hardiness is they'll accumulate these sugars, these starches in the wood. And we need that to happen. So that's why we talk about post-harvest health of the vine. So if you had a lot of stress last year, there's a chance that you potentially have received more winter injury. Likewise, during this acclimation period, summer into the fall, the grapes and the cells will also start to accumulate certain types of proteins. We call all this together cryoprotectants because they protect the tissue. And then going into the fall, especially with leaf drop, what happens inside the woody parts of the plant and the buds is the tissue dehydrates. And so it's getting rid of the free water, which can then freeze and cause damage. That's where the damage comes from, in the freeze. And so by getting rid of the water, one, there's less water to freeze, but then two, it concentrates those cryoprotectants. And then they also will bind to the free water in there to prevent ice formation. So we want that to happen. That's a good thing. And then as the temperatures cool going into the fall, as the days get shorter, the grapes get increasingly cold hardy, especially with cool temperatures. So what we would love to have is a steady cooling off in the fall into the winter, and grapes would then reach their maximum cold hardiness sometime in midwinter. And so in a cool climate, it's more common for them to cool off and stay cool, and those grapes will acclimate to a high degree of cold hardiness. Here in Texas, because we have temperatures that will stay warm frequently into the fall, or we'll have warm stretches during the winter, we have deacclimation, which is just the loss of cold hardiness. And the important point here is that it occurs much faster than acclimation. With acclimation, we're talking about weeks to months. With deacclimation, we're talking about days to weeks. So it's a much faster process. And that's one of the challenges we have here in Texas. And so you've probably seen this figure possibly in a textbook. This is depicting the hardiness of a grapevine bud in a cool climate. And so that red line right there, it's the minimum temperature. It's the LT50, which means the lethal temperature at which 50% of the buds would die. And as you see from August into September, November, October, you see this steady decrease in the LT50. So the grapes are increasing in their hardiness. And then midwinter is when you see the greatest hardiness. What you'll also notice is the black line, which is the outside temperature, the minimum temperature, it steadily declines as well. That's not necessarily the case for us here in Texas. You know, our weather's much more erratic than that. So we have warming. And if you look after February, you can see the deacclimation phase. It's much more rapid. That curve is much more steep because grapes respond much more rapidly to warm temperatures than cool temperatures. And so that's one of the things that presents a challenge to us in many years. And so historically, our freezes, and Pierre is going to talk more specifically about the difference between this freeze event versus 2017, 18, or 2019, the Halloween massacre. It's very different because the grapes were at a different stage of acclimation. So when we're talking about the potential for winter injury to occur, one, it's that acclimation. You know, how well are the grapes acclimated? Two, it's the inherent cold hardiness of the grape variety. Some varieties can withstand colder temperatures, and you know this, there are more cold hardy vinifera like Riesling and Cabernet Franc. But then there's also this deacclimation issue. So how warm has it been leading up to that cold event? And then two, how does that particular grape variety respond? And so I have an example here that doesn't necessarily apply to Texas, but it's good for understanding purposes. In the north, they grow Concord, and it's quite cold hardy. It's much more cold hardy than Cabernet Sauvignon. When it is fully acclimated, it can tolerate lower temperatures, so it's less likely to get damaged in midwinter. However, Concord deacclimates much more rapidly than Cabernet Sauvignon. So going into the spring after warm temperatures, it actually becomes subject to a greater potential to damage because it deacclimates faster. And the reason I'm telling you this stuff is because we're growing a lot of different varieties of grapes in Texas, and we expect that they're going to have differences in their maximum cold hardiness and the rate of deacclimation. And that information, we just don't necessarily know, but we want to learn, of course, as much as we can. So from your perspective of your vineyard, if you are in the Gulf Coast, you were much more in that deacclimation phase going into spring than, say, if you were in the high plains. And so here's our example from that 2017, 2018 freeze that caused some damage, especially in the high plains. What we see if we look at either the minimum temperature or the low temperature, go from November to December, you see a steady decline. But right before the freeze event that occurred right in here, which is right at the end of December, the weather leading up to that was actually quite warm. So you had this really rapid drop. So those grapes were not fully acclimated, and there was damage in the single digits. When if they would have been fully acclimated, there may not have been any damage whatsoever. It did vary by variety. It did vary by age of the vines and then site. But there are differences between freeze events. Okay. So whenever vines are fully acclimated, we know that dormant buds tend to be the most prone to freeze damage when the vines are fully acclimated. Canes would be next as far as prone to freeze damage, and then cordons and trunks would be the least sensitive. And so it's all going to depend about that acclimation, deacclimation, because sometimes, and what we saw in 2017, 2018 is we actually saw some vines where the buds were still green, yet there was tissue damage to the canes and even the trunks and the cordons. And Fran has already cut some buds in the Gulf Coast that were green, but the canes themselves were actually injured and are probably most likely going to die. So even though the buds are green, the wood is injured and those buds will ultimately die. So it's not as simple as just the buds themselves and saying, well, if I don't have any bud damage, then I don't have any wood damage. It's going to depend on, the state of the vines in dormancy. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about assessment of bud damage. So we'll start with buds, and we know that grapes have compound buds. So if you look at a grape bud, you cut it open, you can actually see that there are 3 buds inside. The primary bud is the one that comes out first. It bears most of the fruit, if not all of the fruit. The secondary bud will typically emerge if something happens to the primary. It can be anywhere from unfruitful to slightly fruitful. There are a handful of hybrids that are more fruitful, but in vinifera, the secondary is much less fruitful. And then finally, the tertiary, which is typically not fruitful at all. And so this is our insurance. And so when we go in and we cut buds, what we're trying to do is to determine if our fruit-producing primary bud has been damaged. And what we do is we go out into the vineyard, we collect canes. We need a good representation. This is very much like a fruit sample to assess harvest. we expect there to be some variation from vine to vine. So we want to sample somewhere typically around 20 to 30 vines. We want to sample around 100 buds. And so go out, collect 20, 30 canes, and we want to assess, 2 to 4 buds per cane. What we're most interested in are those lower buds that are going to be more consistent in size, as well as the bud maturity to the spurs that we're going to keep. We're going to bring those and make sure that those have been warmed at room temperature or warmer for at least 24 hours, because when we have a freeze, the cells rupture, and then after it warms up, the contents leak out, they oxidize, and they turn brown. So what we're looking for is brown in that primary bud. In our center picture, we can see that primary bud is nice and green. It's alive. Okay, here's another look at a bud. This is a side profile view. And I put this in here. This is actually Black Spanish. And I know a lot of you aren't growing Black Spanish, but I included this because buds are going to be different based on what stage they're in, as far as are they starting to swell or not, and even by variety. Black Spanish is unique in that it has a lot of wool at the top of the bud. You can see it at the very top. So if you just cut the tip of that bud off, it's going to look brown naturally because of the wool. And so when we're sampling buds, we want to start at pretty much the tip. You'll get the hang of it after you cut quite a few, and you start to cut slices out of it until the primary bud becomes exposed. And ultimately what we want to do is cut into that primary bud so that we can see it. It's going to look something like this. Got a razor blade. You really want to use a razor blade because 1, the blade is very thin and it cuts more smoothly, and 2, of course, it's sharp. If you have something dull or a larger blade like a pocket knife, it will more smear that wool and it's harder to see. You can see we're cutting slices off here. Now, if you cut too deep, if you continue to cut, I don't know if you can tell, but the center of that bud is now green. It was brown initially. The primary bud was dead, but we cut too deep. And when you do that, you cut below the buds into what's called the bud cushion. And you can have primary bud death, and the bud cushion will often still remain green. So we have a little figure here that shows different cuts of a dead primary bud. It's the same bud. The first cut here on the left, we cut into that primary bud. The tissue is dead. It's brown. You can see the brown center. It's necrotic. We cut a little bit deeper in cut number 2. We can still see that primary bud. It's dead. Now what we're seeing is that secondary bud on the left actually is now green. So we've cut into that secondary bud. So we know that the primary bud's dead, but the secondary bud is still living. And that's important to look at. If you have a lot of primary bud death, then we're going to want to go in and make sure that we're also looking at secondary buds as well. And then finally, you can continue and you can see the tertiary bud. Often it's much smaller. But if you cut too deep, it will give you a sort of a false sense of security, or a false sense that the buds are alive. So that picture on the right, that is the bud cushion. That is no longer the bud. So I cut below the bud and you can see it's green. The primary bud's dead, but it still appears alive if you just look at the bud cushion. So we have to know what we're looking for. This is hard to do in the field, honestly. And it's hard to do just with the naked eye unless you have a really good vision. So a magnifying glass is helpful. It's better just to bring the canes in, sit on a bench where it's somewhere comfortable, and start cutting buds. And then you're going to calculate the proportion of primary buds that have died. While you're doing this, it's worthwhile to look at the vascular tissue. That's a cane we just cut with the same knife right underneath the bark and flipped it up. And we're looking at potential for damage to the vascular tissue. So it's just like the bud tissue. It's going to turn water soaked in color when it's damaged, and it's going to turn brown with time. Now, when it comes to the vascular tissue of the canes, the cordons, the trunks, we're most specifically looking at the phloem and the vascular cambium. So if we look at the picture on the top right, this is a cane cross section. So we took a cane, we just cut it off with some shears. I've got a nice lens on the camera, and I've labeled the phloem is right underneath the bark. It's that light colored layer right underneath the bark. That is the tissue that transports the nutrients produced by the leaves throughout the plant. Immediately after that is this really light colored ring. It's very thin. That's the vascular cambium. And what that does is that produces new phloem towards the outside and new xylem towards the inside every year. The xylem is the water conducting tissue, and that's the bulk of the tissue that you're seeing inside of a cane. whenever you weed whack around a tree and you ring it or you girdle it, a lot of times it will die, and that's because you've cut through the phloem and the vascular cambium. And if you do that, the tree can no longer repair itself. If the vascular cambium is destroyed, it has no mechanism to repair. Or even if all of the phloem is destroyed, it has no mechanism to now transport nutrients throughout the plant. So that's what we're evaluating, because those two tissues are more prone to freeze damage than the xylem itself. They're located right underneath the bark, and they're more prone to freeze damage. So that's what we're evaluating. In this cut on the top left, I have taken that knife and cut into that wood, and you can see it's light green to dark green around the edge of that. That is the phloem and the vascular cambium. We want to see green to, it depends on variety and condition, light green, very light green to even dark green like this photo. When it is damaged, and these are Blanc de Bois canes cut this year after 1 week after the freeze event in the Gulf Coast. If it's damaged, what we'll typically see is the xylem in the middle will often still look light in color, doesn't look all that different, but the phloem and the vascular cambium is now brown. So that cane has major damage on that side. Some, you could cut, if you see it, it's widespread, those canes are very likely to die. Sometimes it will only be a small section of the wood, but while you're cutting buds and you have canes, it's definitely worthwhile to look. And then we have a cross section on the right, and if you look and compare it to the photo that's healthy, you can see that phloem is brown, and it's harder to see in that cross section, but it is visible. And over time, and I'm talking in a fairly short period of time, what we'll start to see is more browning and even drying. So what's interesting is the vines that we took a lot of these cuttings from that are damaged in these photos, we're already bleeding sap once again. So on the Gulf Coast, we already had sap flow in many cases. We had the freeze event, and sap flow when we're out cutting these canes had already started once again. So it can give you a false sense that, oh, the vines are okay, sap is flowing, but cutting a lot of those canes, we saw damage. And you can see varying degrees here. In the top, we can still see that browning. And as you go down, you can see the damage is, in the case of the very bottom, those canes had already started to desiccate a lot. You can see it in the cross section and in the photo on the bottom. So these were damaged and already began to desiccate. And so most of the damage we saw, and Fran will talk more about this, the most was in vineyards that were already stressed for one reason or another. And then it also depended on the phenological stage, how advanced they were and close to bud break. A very obvious sign as you walk through your vineyard also is cracks to the trunks and along the cordons. And I know Jim's going to talk about this a little more and probably in more detail as well. But I think the key here is that you can look at canes, and it's easy to do while you're cutting buds. But unless the wood is damaged throughout, it is very hard, if not impossible, to determine the extent of damage to the trunks and the cordons right now at this point. So, I mean, if everything was destroyed, you might be able to see it by going out and making cuts. But a lot of times what we'll see is damage to different sections of the trunk, different sections of the cordon. And so you're not really going to be able to get a full assessment until after bud break and even later on in the season. So one of the telltale signs of damage is bud break is going to be sporadic across the block. And especially if you see suckering towards the base of the vine or on the cordons in places that you normally wouldn't see heavy suckering, that's a good indication that you've had some wood damage to those vines. And then finally, I don't say this to instill any sense of fear or anything, or say that you're not out of the woods and you don't have any problems, but vines can collapse. So vines can break bud normally and actually grow as if nothing was wrong, but you can have enough damage to that vascular tissue that, especially in midsummer, when you've got a full canopy, it's hot, the vines need water the most, they're using the most water, they can actually collapse because there's not enough healthy conductive tissue to support those vines. And so you can see vine collapse in the summer. So like I said, I'm not trying to say that, trying to say this to scare you, but I'm trying to, tell you what you can look for, because people want to know, when am I in the clear? When am I out of the woods? And so if you do have damage, you may still see vine collapse, even in otherwise healthy looking vines later on in the season. And so I'll stop there and turn it over to Dr. Nesbitt. He is going to talk a little bit more about the context of this freeze as it relates to ice and snow and insulative effects and so on.
Yeah, thank you, Justin, and greetings to everybody. Again, my area of expertise is fruit trees, berries, not so much grapes. I worked in Alabama 15 years, and I worked a lot on citrus. I'm going to take you out of the vineyard for a moment and show you an effort to save a citrus planting. Fran, are you seeing my screen here?
Yeah, it looks good. Oh,
This
and
is,
yeah.
so this is a satsuma planting in Brazoria County last week, and they're using scaffold branch irrigation, micro sprinklers in the center of the tree. 2 of them, they have about 30 gallons per hour per tree, and this is during the week at some point. Notice this is a little spray stake that's providing water to the trunk, graft union, the lower branches. He has a second sprinkler a little higher up on some of the trees. Folks, this is like walking a tightrope. And this man's name is Chris Sturdivant. He is a satsuma grower near Alvin, Texas. And if you've never done this, this is a terrifying experience. Notice he's going to break away from the ice that's starting to deflect. Spray pattern should be up around the trunk, and it's being deflected by some of these branches that are hanging down. Mr. Sturdivant ran water starting Sunday morning, I believe, all the way through Saturday morning in an effort to protect this citrus orchard. This takes a lot of water. It's about 30 to 35 gallons per hour per tree. And a few hundred trees in this orchard, all the water's got to run at the same time. You're in big trouble if the power goes out. He had a power outage, but he had a generator that came on instantaneously. If the water delivery stops and you have wind and continued damaging temperatures, you're worse off than if you'd ever ran water at all. Now, what I'm going to use this is a little bit of discussion on this concept of creating ice, what it does, what it can't do, and then maybe some differences with snow. All right, let me get out of this. And share. So I think a discussion of how irrigation can be used to prevent freeze damage. Most orchardists, vineyardists have got an irrigation system. Can this be used as a tool in a defense in an event like this, a lesser event? It has that possibility. If you have enough water and water is not limiting in some other way, then this is a possibility. What we'll also learn from this is what role moisture, particularly snow and ice and sleet, may have had in this event that we just experienced. So let me... Sorry, I'm moving things around here. So, trying to get slides. Here we go. So when water freezes, there's this wonderful concept called the latent heat of fusion. And as you convert liquid to a solid, it gives off heat. And so this has all been worked out, and the science on it is pretty strong. And it's very predictive in terms of BTUs of heat that are generated by freezing water. And so a gallon of water, it weighs 8.35 pounds. So each gallon that freezes gives off 1,202 BTUs. That's all very precise. Depending on the temperature of the water, there's additional BTUs that are released. So you can view a water sprinkler as a heater if the water can continually apply water that converts to ice on the target that you're trying to protect. Now, as you saw in the video, sometimes branches start to weigh down and and interfere with the pattern of water. But the intent of a sprinkler is to apply water to a specific target, be that a crown, a cordon, whatever the tissue is you're trying to protect. You've got to continually apply water at a fast enough rate and a high enough rate to offset the cooling pressure that's happening from the atmosphere and the wind. And so if you can create this favorable energy balance, you can keep plant tissues from freezing, or reaching a critical temperature that then they will be damaged at. Water, so generally what happens is you reach this equilibrium point where the water contacted tissues, and those are often building up a sleeve or cone of ice, will stay at or around about 32 degrees, which is generally not harmful for the plants that we're working with. Now, the reason this can work is that ice is a poor insulator, because we're layering water on the top, continually on the top surface. Ice is forming, new water is being applied to that layer of ice, and because the heat that's generated from the latent heat of fusion can travel through the ice to the plant tissue, that's how it is actually protected. It is not a process of insulation. Ice is a solid, so it has conductance properties and negligible to no R value in terms of insulation. So the idea of applying ice, a layer of ice to your grapevines or to your cordon arms, whatever the structure is that's critical to the future of your production, the idea of coating that in water, turning the water off, and having a insulating layer is completely false. That will hurt you more than it will help you. It's because the ice is a poor insulator that the concept of latent heat of fusion can work on a citrus tree or on a grapevine. Now, we had snow, we had ice, we had sleet, wintry mix, whatever you want to call it. And these are different materials as far as what they're doing to the plant tissues that they're in contact with. The difference in ice and snow, we had snow, and I think there's some benefits that many of you may be experiencing, bud hardiness that Dr. Shiner just talked about, et cetera, may come from snow rather than from ice. You got to think and understand that snow is a complex lattice. It's a mixture of air and water and ice crystals. It's kind of transitioning. It's not this continuum solid entity. A lattice is a very good description of what snow is. And so because it's a lattice, it has air within it. Air voids act as insulation. And so lots of pockets of air provide some benefits. So snow is an insulator, and its R value varies depending on the moisture content and density of the snow granules. I'm not sure I understand fully what a snow granule is, but average snow, powdery, fluffy snow, has an R value of about 1 per inch, which is the same as wood. And so a 12-inch layer of snow has been compared equal to about a 2x4 wall filled with fiberglass insulation. I think most of us would want to spend a night like this inside a 2x4 wall filled with insulation. 12 12 inches of snow would tend to accomplish the same thing. So what may have helped us last week in this February event, which I think from a timing perspective was potentially damaging to grapes and a lot of other plant material, depending on their phenology and where they were in terms of deacclimation, could have been ameliorated somewhat with presence of snow. None of us really have a snow blowing machine or snow fabricating machine. Maybe that would be something we need to work on. But the concept of snow and ice, those are different entities and may have offered some different things. This is an infrared picture I took on a satsimetry. What you see here is a spaghetti tube coming up to a flat fan type spray pattern. The lower part of the trunk of this satsimetry that's being directed or being contacted by water spray droplets has a temperature up here, according to this temperature graph on the right, up in the 40s, perhaps 40 to 40, the top of this temperature chart, and the white color is about 43 degrees. You get out away from that spray pattern and things get very, very cold. And so it just shows the benefit. You often have water coming out of a well that's in the 40s or 50s degree temperature. That's a benefit. That water has to cool and then freeze, and then that gives off heat. And so all this exothermic activity is beneficial to plant tissues that are near it. You get very far away from the water, continual application of water, and then you begin to have some problems. Heat loss is approximately 1,070 BTUs per pound of water evaporated. In a high wind situation, the additional trepidation of using irrigation for freeze protection or frost protection is that if you're doing this in a windy event, the amount of temperature loss is very, very great. And some people have postulated that it's near impossible to keep this energy balance favorable in wind speeds in excess of about 15 miles per hour. So you've got to have a lot of water. You've got to be able to run it. Rolling blackouts would be a disaster for this situation. You've got to have backup power. The water apply has got to be 7.5 times higher than the evaporation rate to balance against evaporation loss. Evaporative cooling is a real thing. And so to use your irrigation system, the reason it's been explored is that we invest in irrigation systems, and in areas where we have lots of water to bring to bear on every plant or vine, or at least those that we want to protect in an event like this, is that it can be quite inexpensive and very fast to bring to bear in terms of a defense. But it comes with quite a bit of trepidation and potential problems. This is a scary sight. This is an old picture of mine. The video that I just showed you, I think, tells this tale quite well. When it works, we protect a core, and that core can spring back to life pretty quickly and regrow the outer shell. Now, Mr. Sturdivant's citrus trees are showing a lot of damage to the exterior, upper, outer part of the canopy. That's what we expect. The system is not intended to protect all this bearing surface, which is so easily and very quickly regrown. It's intended to protect the trunk, and maybe for a grape vineyard, the idea would be to protect the trunk there, and perhaps the cordon arms or whatever your training system is, so that you get back to production very, very quickly. Very difficult to save fruit, very difficult to save blooms, which are much more sensitive structures than typically buds or woody tissues. I could go on and talk to you about differences in doing this overhead, over the top of the vineyard, under the tree, or a more directed or targeted approach. We can advise you if you want to undertake this. Understand that there are sprinkling rates that have been proposed. That takes, if you go at the low end of about 0.12 acre inches per hour of water, that's 54 gallons per minute per acre. Do you have that kind of water delivery capability? If you do, maybe you can work this out. This is a slide I got from Ed Hellman several years ago, and this was the Cartwright Vineyard, I believe, in Mason, Texas, 2007. They had a sprinkling rate of 0.15 acre inches per hour, 70 gallons per minute per acre. This was, I guess, an Easter type event. 224 sprinklers for 8.1 acres, total output 560 gallons per minute, operated continuously for 34 hours, over 1 million gallons of water applied. 2 days later, it looked pretty good as I understand it. So yeah, I don't know much more about that particular event. Maybe some of my coworkers do. This can work, but you've got to be very, very careful, and you really need to work with professionals to design a system for this. And you're probably going to need professional guidance the first time you do this, because it is the first time you do this and experience this, you will want at least a bottle of wine on hand to drink to get through this. Mentally, it can be very challenging. So that's all I've got, and I'm happy to hang around and answer questions on this.
Thank you, Monty. If you do have questions, you can put them in the chat box, but we're going to move along now to Jim Comas. There's Jim. Take it away.
Thanks, Fran. I just wanted to share some perspective on freezes we've seen over the last number of years. I've been back in Texas since 1996, and there were a couple of back-to-back years that really caught my attention. The first was in 2010. On the 8th of February in 2010, we had 7 degrees Fahrenheit in Fredericksburg. It was the coldest I'd seen, and many people had seen. We were very afraid that there was a lot of considerable damage to the trees and vines in Gillespie County. But because the winter had been cold since starting at Christmas, low temps in the 20s, and in January, mid-teens, the first few days in February, there was absolutely no damage to peaches, berries, grapes, anything. Everything was absolutely sound. But the following year, on February 1st, 2011, it was 78 degrees, but on February 2nd, it was 14 degrees. And we had massive trunk injuries to apples, peaches, grapes. Blackberries were frozen to the ground. So you can see the difference there in what Justin described as deacclimation, which was what exactly we know what happened that caused injury to those plants. Okay, so the 2021 event on the 4th of February, we had 83.67 degrees, pretty problematic in the middle of winter. On the 9th of February, we had 74.53 degrees. And on both the 16th and 17th of February, my temperature gauge recorded 3.17 degrees in Fahrenheit at that location at our research plots in Fredericksburg. You know, if anybody had, well, people did ask me, I said, things are toast. It's over. I mean, we have massive damage. But, you know, you wait till the power comes back on. You wait a week for the tissue to kind of start talking to you. And so why is this, and that's not what we're seeing. So why is this not like 2011? Well, the answer is 6 days. Now, the textbooks teach us a lot about acclimation, and they teach us about deacclimation. What they don't give us much information on is reacclimation. What does it take for vines or trees or any kind of plant material to reacclimate to cold winter temperatures and survive a hard freeze? This was the period of 6 days of reacclimation. You can see the temperature, again, started in the mid-70s, but then it slowly went down into the 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s, and then teens until we finally hit 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Evidently, this is what saved most of our plants in the hill country. Now, I'm not saying everything's there's no injury at all, but I'm saying that this is not, I'm not seeing the massive injury that I, in my mind, predicted that I would see. Again, Justin showed you the pictures of the morphology of grapevines. As you mentioned, the majority of damage is to the phloem. Cambial damage and xylem damage can also be problematic. And this is what you'll see if you're looking at damaged tissue. This is what you'll see. You'll peel it back. The xylem will be brown, the phloem will be brown, and certainly the cambium will be destroyed. But again, most serious injury is to the phloem. So in some cases, you know, cold injury start seeing is subtle. This is, people are asking, well, what can I expect to see in the spring? You know, when you start to see bud break, and as it was mentioned, sporadic bud break, and then very lethargic bud break where things just aren't really moving, it's probably your first clue. In other instances, it becomes obvious shortly after bud break. You know, things force out and then just immediately collapse. As Justin mentioned, over the course of the summer, you'll see damaged tissue start to collapse and show itself. And typically, you can consider it freeze injury when the sucker growth is more vigorous and healthy than the old cordon. And at that point, you know you've got some major tissue damage. We'll talk about how to handle this toward the end of the program today, but that's pretty much what you can expect to see. Transpirational summer needs, again, it's when you have a canopy out there and it starts to get hotter, and the higher the respiration, the higher transpirational needs, that's when the tissue collapses and you can see what's really been hurt. But what do we see in the hill country in terms of tissue? Some of the varieties we think are most susceptible: Viognier, Montepulciano, Roussan, Sangiovese, Petit Syrah, Grenache, Syrah, and even young stuff. This is, I think I talked to Michael Cook about this, was perhaps what surprised me the most. You typically think of an old trunk as being a hardy trunk, but the newly planted stuff, first and second leaf vines, they're absolutely fine. They look great. So I was shocked, pleasantly so, but this is kind of how you take a look at it. Again, in terms of bud hardiness, Justin shows you this slide as well in terms of the periods of major hardiness and deacclimation. Martin Goffinet's classic pictures on bud morphology. And, you know, I'm not like some of the younger guys who use a razor blade in the field, even with an optivisor. I am much more comfortable cutting canes, putting them under a dissecting scope, and using an X-Acto knife. I even have to change blades a few times just because the more buds you cut, you start smearing the buds around and you need a nice sharp edge. Photos we took this last week. Here's beautiful buds that have no injury whatsoever. You can see the primary bud in the center, secondary bud, and tertiary bud above. This one, you can have exactly the opposite, where all three are killed. Primary, secondary, and tertiary bud are all dead. This is typically what we look at when we see bud injury, is the primary bud is lost, secondary and tertiary are okay. But you can also see it the other way, where the primary bud is fine and the secondary has been badly injured. So now we'll talk about that toward the end. So I'm done, and let's. I think it's time my turn to pass it off to Pierre.
Okay, in my presentation, I will talk a little bit about what we saw during the last 3 years in Texas High Plains. So all my data is from the Texas High Plains AVA. But when I came to Texas in 2016, I learned two things. The first one is how to follow the weather data. So I have like maybe 3 or 4 weather app on my phone. So I follow the data every day, the weather every day, because what I saw in Texas is the weather is pretty unpredictable, mainly in the winter. The winters in Texas are unpredictable and sometimes can be extreme, like this year. So during the last few years, like 17, 18, 19, 20, 20, 2020, 21, I saw in the vineyard a lot of winter damage. So we had several winter damage during the last few years. So winter damage in Texas, in fact, is very common. It's not something mainly in the high plains. Maybe in the other region in Texas, it's not that common, but in the high plains, it's pretty common. And every year there is a different scenario. So I will go through this scenario just to show you how, when we talk about cold damage or written damage, it's not always the same thing. So different weather, and so will get us different scenario. Here I will start with year winter 2017, 2018. And here, as you can see on the graph, so the gray lines are the maximum temperature, and the yellow lines is minimum temperature. And as you can see, in 2017, 2018, there were a lot of temperature fluctuation. It's not that steady. It's like temperatures go up and down during the winter. And also you can see that during, I would say, October and November, the winter was not very, very cold. As you can see, it was a little bit warm on the warmer side of the winter. And what happened during early January, a rapid drop of the temperature occurred. So we had around 4 degrees Fahrenheit during this day. And this was just after a warm winter. So when you have a warm winter, cold injury can happen at much higher temperature. So this is what happened during 2017, 2018. Rapid drop in temperature, and it was extreme temperature, and this is what caused a lot of winter damage. And during this winter, we saw a lot of cordon split and trunk split, and this is typical when you see when you have a rapid drop in temperature after a very warm winter. So this was in 2017, 2018. In 2019, 2020, it was a completely different scenario. In this year, it was a little bit very unique. So in this year, we had a very, very long harvest, and harvest occurred maybe around the 15th of October, as you can see here on this green arrow. And few weeks later, temperature dropped to around 17 or 18 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was a very, very early freeze. Now it's known in Texas High Plains as a Halloween massacre, and it happened really few weeks after the harvest. So vine didn't have time to go dormant, and they didn't have time to go hardy. They were still green. We still have a lot of movement in phloem and xylem, and the freeze happened directly after this, and this caused a lot of damage. In this year, so it was, we saw a lot of very bad injuries, maybe in the majority of the varieties. All the varieties were the same in terms of injury, because all the varieties, mainly the late harvested varieties, didn't have time to go dormant, and we got these cold temperatures, and this hammered everything. And so 2020 was a very sad year of very low yields in the Texas High Plains. This year, it was completely different. So 2020, 2021 winter was also kind of extreme. And we had, in fact, 2 freezes in Texas High Plains. The first one happened around 1st of November. And the second one happened late in February. So the one in November, it was a similar scenario as the year 2019, 2020, which was an early freeze during the acclimation phase. But the major difference was that harvest ended way earlier this year. Like I said, the 2020 harvest was a little bit sad and very quick. So it happened really early in September. So the freeze happened later. So vine had some time to go dormant in this case. But what I want really to focus on is the freeze that happened in February, 14 and 15 of February. And I'm glad that Jim talked about this just before this presentation, and he talked about reacclimation. So as you can see, during this winter, starting maybe early December, temperatures start to drop, and mainly this reacclimation process happened here, around early February. So temperature drops slowly and reach the maximum during February 14 and 15. And I think this had to put the vine in the situation where they can survive the extreme cold during the winter. And this was also during the maximum hardiness. So maximum hardiness of grapevine happened during February and January. So they were really ready to get this extreme cold temperature. And plus, we have a high humidity in the air. I think this also was a positive point. during this winter. So as you can see, none of the scenarios are the same. One scenario was like a rapid drop in temperature, which called winter injury. Another one was a freeze event was super early in the season during the acclimation phase. We had winter injury. And this year it was a completely different scenario where temperature dropped very, very low to the single digits. So this is also manifest in another type of winter injury. So different scenario, we cannot really do anything about them except two things, maybe in my opinion. The first one is to really pick the right variety for your site, because not all varieties behave the same. They have different behaviors. So some of them are cold sensitive, some of other are cold hardy. So picking the right variety is so super important. And the second thing you can do is to manage properly your vineyard. I'm not covering this. Jim, I think he would speak about how to manage correctly your vineyard for maximum hardiness and how to recover. But I will speak about the first point, which is why it's important to pick the right variety for your site. And here I'm talking about cold hardy varieties. So I'm sure that you saw a lot of these tables online where you can see that they put on the variety and they said this variety can tolerate temperature to -10 degrees Fahrenheit, for example. And you can, I suppose you wonder how they got this information. And the data we saw online, they are all from other states, like cold climate state, like Washington or New York, but none of the data is from Texas. This is why many growers get together, plus with Texas A&M AgriLife extension, and we said we need to start a project where we can analyze different varieties and see which one will do better in a cold winter in Texas. So we started this project in 2019, and I was publishing this data on the social media. So I would go and if you saw our post, maybe you are familiar with it, but I will tell you a little bit what are this data I'm posting there. So we started this project, the Bud called Hardiness real-time monitoring, and this project had two goals. The first one is to determine the lethal temperature of the studied varieties. Justin spoke a little bit about lethal temperature. So lethal temperature is when your buds start to be damaged when the daily minimum temperature reach this temperature. So if variety have different lethal temperature, and it's important to know this temperature so we can know at which temperature this variety will be damaged. And the second goal of this project is to assess bud injury during winter temperature in a real-time period, okay? So for this project, we work on 5 varieties, Arianico, Cabernet Sauvignon, Marsanne, Montepulciano, and Roussanne. So I will tell you how we were collecting this data. So this year, for example, every Tuesday morning, we go to the field and we collect samples from each of these varieties. We took these cane samples to the lab and we cut the buds. So we separate the cane from the buds. We don't cut into the bud, we cut maybe here just at the base of the bud. So the bud is still not damaged. So this is all the buds we cut for each variety. So for example, here, for example, this is Cabernet Sauvignon, and you can see there is more than 75 or 100 bud per variety. And we do the same for each variety. So we collect the buds, this we call bud sampling, and we put these buds in these small cells. So these cells, for example, this is a cell where we put 5 buds of variety X. Let's say it's Roussanne. So this cell contains 5 varieties of 5 buds of Roussanne, and each of these cells also contain a temperature sensor. So we have here 9 cells, and each cell have 5 buds, and each of this cell is connected to a temperature, a sensor temperature, the sensor of temperature, okay? And we put the entire cells in this freezer. So this freezer, it's go from the temperature of this freezer drop from 40 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And when temperature of this freezer hits the lethal temperature of the variety we are studying, so this variety, this bud is alive, so it has water in it. And when this bud will die, so the water inside this bud will go from liquid to solid. And when it goes from liquid to solid, it will release some heat. And you remember on each cell there is a heat sensor. So this sensor will register the heat that was emitted. So by doing this, we know at which temperature the bud is dead. So we can determine the lethal temperature of the bud of this variety we are studying. So for example, this is an example. So this is Roussan, and at minus, I think this is minus 18 here. This is when the heat was released, that we know that Roussan at minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit is dead for this sampling time. And we do this every week for other varieties we are studying. And so we can come with this graphs. And I will tell you a little bit about this graph. So in blue, this light blue color is the daily minimum temperature in Texas High Plains. This is in Lubbock. And the different colors here are different varieties. So for example, if we take this date here, this was in January 19. So we collected some buds, we run them through the freezer, and for each variety, we came with the lethal temperature of this variety. For example, Aglianico, we now know that on January 19, Aglianico can be damaged, or the buds will be dead at minus 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Cabernet Sauvignon will die or will be damaged on another temperature, minus 3.7, for example. And this can tell us one thing, that Cabernet Sauvignon can tolerate more cold than Aglianico. Same thing for Marsanne. Marsanne minus 3.6, bud damage will be seen for Marsanne at minus 3.6 on January 19. And we'll do the same for Montepulciano and Roussan. And this can tell us two stories. The first one, that Roussan is the most cold hardy variety between these 5 varieties, because on the same date, Roussan will die at minus 5 degrees Fahrenheit, while Aglianico will die on a higher temperature, which is minus 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So Roussan is more cold hardy than Aglianico, for example. And also the other point we can see here is that these varieties, they reach their maximum hardy point here at this time on January 19. So we can see that they are like pretty cold hardy varieties, and this is how we start to classify the varieties, which one is cold sensitive and which one is cold hardy. So this is what we are doing during this winter, and things were pretty nice. So the temperature, the daily minimum temperature during the winter were always higher than the later temperature of the varieties we studied until February 14 and 15. So on February 14 and 15, as you can see, this is the daily minimum temperature in light blue. Temperature were really low, and we hit maybe minus 1 degrees Fahrenheit in Lubbock. And as you can see, the minimum daily temperature was below the lethal temperature of some of the varieties we are studying. And when you see this, you can expect winter damage. So, for example, the Aglianico, which is in orange, Aglianico will say the lethal temperature of Aglianico on February, it was minus 2.8. No, it was higher than this. It was maybe 2.8. And you can see that the minimum daily temperature was -1. So the cold temperature was way below the lethal temperature of Aglianico. In this case, so we are expecting damage to this variety. So this real-time monitoring will help predicting if damage will happen for the variety we are studying. So in what happened in 2021, so as you can see that daily minimum temperature were below of the lethal temperature of some varieties. So winter injury is expected. I don't have a lot of information yet about how bad is the damage, but what we can say is that winter injury can be expected in the high plains. This is why it's so important before going and pruning, it's so important to know how the intensity of this damage. This is why we recommend to go and collect buds and dissect buds to see the percentage of variability of your buds for each plot you are following. The good news is that I heard that some growers were already dissecting bud and they didn't see a lot of damage as in 2019, which is a great news. And the other good news is that after the damage, it was after the freeze that happened in February 15, this was like last Tuesday, I ran some data through the software I showed you earlier, and I saw that buds are still alive, which is also another good news. So this is, for example, Rusan, and when I took buds from the field after the freeze and put them in the freezer, the buds came as alive, which is also a good news. So bud dissection, I think they are telling us that there is some viability there, better than 2019, and also the the experiment I'm doing, telling us also the same story that buds are still alive. So these are two good news. Why they are alive? It seems maybe the humidity helped during the freeze in February, and also the reacclimation process that James talked about. So this could be also two things that helped in making this year better than 2019. So like I said, I don't have a lot of information yet about how bad or the intensity of the damage, but hope it's not like in 2019. And with this, I'm done with my presentation, and I will give the platform to the next speaker.
I just wanted,
yes.
Dr. Elway, I just wanted to mention, some people had been asking where we can find that data that you put out every week. And so Danny Hillen posted a link in the chat box,
Yes.
but it's posted on our Facebook page, Texas Viticulture and Enology. So if you haven't already liked our Facebook page, go ahead. But yeah, Danny put the link in the chat box for everyone to see that data.
Yes, so they are posted on our website in details with the temperatures, and you can also see them on Facebook, just a graph with a link to our website. So they are there. And I'm done. Fran?
Thank you, Pierre. Okay, well, now we're going to move on to our reports and start with the High Plains.
Thank you, Fran. Man, everything that I was going to say has already been said. So I didn't put together any slide presentation yet, because mainly the main answer to everything is unfortunately we won't have a clear picture until later in the year as to the extent of the damage. But like I said, man, literally every point I have on my notes right here has already been covered. So I will say that one thing that we do see a lot of in our region is that with regard to winter injury is that it is extremely site, variety, and stress load dependent. So we see differences in the same variety across different sites depending on what kind of weather they were subjected to, and also what kind of crop load they were carrying the year prior. So keeping excellent records as far as crop load will give you a really good indication of how much how much stress you're putting on your vines year to year, and it's only compounded with freeze events like that, like this last one. I would also say real quick, most of the questions I've been getting with regard to this are related to how can we determine how much damage we have, you know, and the best way of doing that, we have a video that we put out. It's on our website and it's on our Facebook page as well, as far as how to cut, to sample buds and take canes and sample buds, and how to actually cut them and what you're looking for. I think Justin showed another video of that early this morning, but sample size of about 100 per variety will give you a good idea of what you're dealing with. Brown or dead phloem tissue, as opposed to live phloem tissue, which is, if you have a vineyard and you've scraped your canes during the growing season, the difference between live tissue and dead. It's just dead tissue is generally very brown, and it can be black in some cases. Cracks in your cordons and your trunks are extremely good indicators of damage. Even early right now, you may not be able to see some of that in some varieties, but some varieties are already showing damage. And these are generally the best ways to look at it right now while they're still dormant. Unfortunately, the full assessment is going to have to wait until after bud break. Some really good indicators. One of the best indicators that I always look for is what Jim brought up a minute ago: heavy suckering after bud break, where you'll get your vines will push, and then you'll have like your shoots maybe that long, but you've got a sucker that's 3 feet long, or 3 or 4 of them. That's an excellent indicator of phloem damage in the trunk or in the cordon somewhere. Severely stunted shoots after bud break. I saw this a couple of years ago with very specific varieties. I don't remember which one they were, but what happens is they'll push, and then immediately within like the first 2 to 3 inches of growth, it will already start to try to push a cluster out. That's another excellent indicator of winter injury, and then the most unfortunate one is going to be vine collapse later in the year. Once that canopy comes out, and you may have phloem damage somewhere or xylem damage, and you just don't have, and the vine doesn't have the capability of supporting that canopy on the limited amount of phloem tissue it has. It's like if you're drinking through a straw and you kind of pinch it, and you can only get so much water through there. So if the vine doesn't have enough water to support the canopy, it will support it as long as it can until it kills itself. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I've got. I know that was kind of short. Bree?
Yeah, so I've been doing with Jim, we've been just dissecting buds left and right. Actually, I just did some and finished it and got all the data crunched right before we started this meeting. So I thought I might share some of those results real quick. So just to look through sort of what we're seeing in hill country so far. As you heard from Pierre, Cab Sauv can be pretty cold hardy, so we kind of expected this one to be low as far as mortality goes. And this is percent of dead buds versus the total number that we've dissected all throughout, just to be clear on that. Malbec, we're at 20%. Merlot, overall, from other folks I've talked to doing bud dissection, what I've seen, a lot of the Merlot is suffering. Although it does depend on cultural practices, which blocks were looked at. And also, whether it was a young vine or versus an old vine. And even some of the different clones perform differently, which I've got some data on that later. The Mourvedre on this slide, I don't really trust this one. I think we only had about 20 buds that were given to us. And out of them, I didn't find any. And what I'm thinking is it's probably, the best pieces of wood they had, clearly, because I was kind of suspicious after looking at a bunch of other Mourvedre that same day. But Tannat and Cab, you can see here, Cab didn't do as well as it did in the previous slide. Again, this is a different site, different weather conditions in that microclimate. And also, it's going to be different cropping. And then this is the ones I did this morning. You can see there's 2 different Merlot clones. And while they're similar, they did perform differently. These are on the same site. So, it's interesting to look from one to the other and see which one actually outperforms. And I will say with all of this, it's not just, is the bud dead? Is it alive? Jim and I were seeing a lot of water soaked tissues. The resulting shoots this year will be interesting to see if they form correctly or if they're just all malformed and mangled, but that's something that we won't know until much later in the season. And again, this isn't high, so Mourvedre is at 30. Tannat, this is probably the best Tannat that I think we had, and this is a young vine, or young vines, sorry, that haven't really been cropped yet, whereas this is where old vine Tannat is at. And that's probably the highest I saw, but ranges for older Tannat vines were between, I'd say, 40 and 80. So older Tannat suffered pretty poorly. I've heard from other folks that every bit of Tannat, Sangio, and Merlot they saw was just toast. Things like Albarino and Viognier, even Grenache, and again, Cab or some of the Merlots, or sorry, Mourvedre has been just fine. So we're seeing pretty big differences from site to site, as Danny was just saying. Also among varieties, we do expect some varieties to be better than others, but some of them are just, they're going to be hurting this year. And this is from the lab at Fredericksburg. We grow the Andy Walker varieties, some of the 88%, and then the 75 is what's now been released as Caminari Noir. And that was the most disappointing to me. And for these, I did look at both primary and secondary bud death. So 38 is doing pretty okay, I'd say, considering at 18% mortality for primary. And I didn't see any secondaries that were damaged at all. The 35 had 22% and then 12% of the secondaries. And then the 75, which was just released as the Caminari Noir, that was kind of the most disappointing. I unfortunately did that one first, so I guess it was, all uphill from there. But we had 60% primary mortality and 52% secondary. So that row those rows are going to be suffering this year. I think in part it's due to the stress that those vines are under. We know we have trunk disease in that block. We know we have viral problems in that block. So again, stresses can make a huge difference as far as how well your buds can fare, how well your vines can fare at events such as this. And I did want to look into a couple of the differences. Oh, and sorry, this is Turtle Creek from Kerrville. Now we're moving south of the hill country. Again, Montepulciano and Cab Sauv did just fine. Merlot was struggling at this site. I will say for this site, and again, I'm not harping on anybody for doing anything wrong or right or whatever here. Turtle Creek last year had major hail damage. Kerrville got hit twice within the span of 3 days. So these vines were recovering already from that. And, there are numerous other things that they could have been dealing with before cold was even a consideration. And then this is probably the southmost one that we work with on a regular basis. This is at Frio Canyon out in Lakey. Syrah is probably the worst here. Merlot, again, site to site, Merlot did better here than it has in other sites. Ruby Cab did just, I'd say that's reasonable. And Tempranillo was fine here too. But you'll notice from one part of the site to the other, Tempranillo had a difference in bud mortality. And I think just to demonstrate the difference from site to site and even clone to clone or block to block, you can have major differences. Maybe this was a difference in cropping, maybe this was a difference in age. or stresses, etc. But again, I think this illustrates the point that, you know, even on the same site, you can have differences among your blocks because of microclimate issues or age of vine, or, you know, struggles that they've gone through already. Again, cab did really well, except for in the one site. I know this looks massive. It's only, you know, it's a 30% difference roughly. But overall, we expect a little bit more hardiness from that one than we do some of the others. And Montepulciano, you know, roughly the same even across sites. This one's going to be more the northern part of the area, and the southern. And Mourvèdre was probably the biggest difference among all of them. But again, these are at, this is at two different sites. Two different sites here, three. The third one, I don't trust this one. We need to do another sample of that. But even same site, but young versus old, you can see a doubling in the injury that we found. And that's about it for that. But, you know, I'm kind of gathering that what we've been seeing in the hill country has been relatively the same. There we go. Relatively the same as what I'm hearing from, you know, friends that are consultants or other people that are doing bud dissection in their labs or in their vineyards. Sorry, I've been spending too much time by the microscope. And I think, you know, I think we can expect a strange year this year. So sorry for the cameo by the vineyard pup. She's been assessing buds with me. Anyway, over to you, Michael.
All right, thanks, Bree. The first thing I want to say is there are some excellent questions in the chat box, and we are going to have time to go over those at the end. And so don't worry, we're going to get to those. Some of them have been answered by our specialists, but just keep that in mind. Let me share my screen. I'm going to talk a little bit about North Texas and really focus right now because it's, as you well know, it's so early. I mean, we're out there in the field. Y'all are out there in the fields looking, assessing your buds and also your canes and maybe even trunks and cordons. And so it's really too early to tell the overall scope, but we do have some data. You can see all of us are working overtime, and it's going to take a couple more weeks at least to get a good handle on the initial or preliminary results. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about North and Northeast Texas, so the region in the green. This is Twiga's Region 2. Again, Michael Cook, I am the viticulture program specialist for this region. The first thing, and what I think overall, the general preliminary outlook is fairly bright. Again, you're going to see differences between the regions in not only the weather that we saw, but also the different varieties grown, and also the stages of acclimation in which they were at, or in just phenology in general. You'll hear from the Gulf Coast in just a little bit, talking more about hybrids. But what we noticed in North Texas, and part of the reason I postulate we are looking decent at this point in time, is the amount of snowfall. And Dr. Nesbitt talked about the difference with the insulative properties between ice and snow. And we received a good amount of snow. Most of us saw at least 5 inches. It was a dry, powdery snow. Remember that lattice? There was a lot of air pockets. And so, you know, that is going to help at least trap some of that ground heat and possibly protect the vines lower down at minimum. And so we all saw a good amount of snow. And the nice thing is that snow fell before the lowest temperatures were witnessed. And so some people received more out east or northwest. The other benefit, and I saw this visually because I was in Houston 1 or 2 days before we hit our lowest temperature, driving up, and I noticed from Huntsville to Fairfield, east of Dallas, that there was ice on all of the trees. There wasn't snow at that time. And when I started moving into the Metroplex, the ice accumulation did not happen. We did not receive much rain or precipitation in the form of liquid. We did receive an ample amount of snow, though. And I think that also, at least for the majority of North Texas, is going to be an added benefit. And so you can see the ice accumulation map here. A lot of us did not see true ice formation. And this is not, of course, in the trees, more, I think, on the roads in general. But so that, I think that's going to help us in our region with the varieties we're growing. Also, the varieties we're growing, as even the hybrids that we grow out more central and east North Texas, everything was still pretty tight. We were not at sap flow overall. The buds were not pushing or swelling, and there was zero bud break. And so Dr. Shiner showed you, I think Pierre did as well. We were essentially in our most dormant point, it looks like. And so our vines were going to be as protected as they would be, during just looking at the time frame here and where they are in dormancy. And so our coldest temperature occurred February 16th. That was a Monday night. I had a greenhouse I was monitoring, so I was outside quite a bit. You can see here, according to the National Weather Service, all of us hit at least 0 down to the negative numbers. And it's important that you have a weather station at your vineyard, because what you'll see is those temperatures, depending on location, might have dipped even below that. So at my house, just north of Denton, we hit -8. And I wanted to see, what does -8 feel like? And cold is cold. I had icicles coming out of my nostrils. And so we did see some pretty significant dip in temperature for the next couple of nights. And that those temperatures did stay cold. Now, in Dallas-Fort Worth, it was recorded the most consecutive hours at or below freezing. And what's interesting about this winter event that we had is not only, like Dr. Shiner mentioned, it affected every single Texan, but in particular in North Texas, it was one of our longest cold spells we've had in a long time. And so the record is in 1983, where there were 295 hours. This doesn't talk about the lowest temperatures, but it does talk about the time we were at below freezing. And that was the record was 1983, 295 hours. Now, if you're just looking at the numbers, we hit consecutively 139 hours above freezing. However, right before that, that week, from the 9th to the 13th of February, we did go above 32. We hit 33, so 1 degree above for 1 hour. Okay, but if you look at everything minus that 1 hour, we stayed cold for a long time, a total of 232 hours. And so that is our second longest stretch of cold. I think one of the other benefits for North Texas is that this cold, the temperatures were dropping gradually. And this is all going to factor in to why it's looking like, from the preliminary results, that everything in general is looking okay. Now, what's interesting is we talk about dissecting buds, but don't forget to go out there and look at your cane material, your cordons and trunks. One of the things that popped out at me is most of the varieties we're assessing, even the cane material is green. The cambial tissue looks good, except for one. In Sangiovese here, it has a beautiful cane, a nice color, but when you scratch that surface, the xylem is green, but you can already tell that the cambial layers, the vascular system, is damaged. And so again, Dr. Stein has coined a term, hurry up and wait. And so a lot of this we're going to have to be waiting on to see the true impact. We did see some primary bud mortality. Here's an example. And so the preliminary results, and this data is going to change as we're going through time and we hear more from growers. We're out in the vineyard assessing. But overall, I think most vineyards witnessed a 30% primary bud mortality or less. And so the results coming in are positive from what I see. I agree with Jim. It's surprising. Roussan, we have a new vineyard that was just put in, second leaf, and all of those appear to be healthy, buds and the wood. You can see the varieties, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, those were pretty much left unscathed. Everything looked great. And then Roussan and moving down, Orange Muscat, Ricatatelli, even Black Spanish. Syrah, Blanc du Bois, Picpoul Blanc, Tannat, Tempranillo, Merlot, a little bit more primary bud mortality for the results coming in. And then the limited data we have right now, it's only been a week, or Mourvèdre and Sangiovese seem to have some increased bud mortality, but also even if the buds looked good in Sangiovese, we're seeing some cane death. And so that is essentially the outlook is our vines, the benefit, our vines were dormant, buds were tight. The temperatures lowered gradually and stayed cold. Snowfall occurred before the lowest temperatures, and we had minimal ice formation. Many growers saturated their soils beforehand, so it looks like the young vines are faring well. Mature vines, overall 0 to 30% primary bud mortality and some cambial damage. So the verdict's out, but at this point, we're looking pretty good. So that's what I have for North Texas. And I think, excuse me, Fran is next. Yes.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, well, first of all, I want to say thank you guys, and I wish I had such good news to share with my Gulf Coast growers. We have not fared as well. As Justin said, we went and collected a lot of buds, went to a lot of vineyards, and I can show you what I have. But at this point, I mean, there just isn't a whole lot of rhyme or reason that what we found. So from Riesel up there, Waco, Brazos Valley, the weather seemed to all be the same. And so did the injury. And then I was giving AgriCumbria shared their weather data with me, and they did not have, I mean, that Gulf breeze seemed to help them. So I see promise there. Refuria, I don't know. And Weslaco was sort of mixed. We had frost damage and severely delayed bud break, which kind of has me nervous there. So don't know what we'll see there. I just put a couple things together with just to show what we looked at. Victoria Red fared the worst in all of our stuff, which shouldn't be surprising. That's why it was abandoned in Arkansas. Blanc de Bois, Black Spanish did better. So they had a low of 4 degrees, and we are known in the Gulf Coast as growing hot climate grapes. Well, they don't do so well in cold climate. The Brazos Valley, that's 7 counties, and I went through the weather, every day through this week of madness, and the weather was consistent pretty much throughout the whole valley, which is interesting, a geographic phenomenon for such a large area. But we did see, okay, we were in high virus vineyards, we were in old vineyards, we were in hail damaged vineyards, we were in lots of different types of vineyards and saw similar damage, except for one, and that was in at Paradox at Doug Rowlett's, where he has a really low lying Blanc de Bois vineyard and Black Spanish, very low lying, which is usually, a headache for late spring frost and flooding. But in this case, I think that low-lying area kept the buds nice and tight and dormant throughout the whole thing. Whereas his other vineyard higher up, there was significant damage to canes and buds, and not just injury, but cane death. So I think the level of dormancy had a lot to do with the with the damage. So here's a list of, if you can see the list, muscadines by far fared the worst, Victoria Red, Blanc de Bois, especially because it had already begun weeping in most places. Black Spanish, we looked at Cabernet Noir. Lamanto seemed to do okay. And then Sagrantino, our true Vitis vinifera without PD resistant, seem to fare the best. So I want to get on to what we can do about this. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this a little short so Jim can get on with our recovery talk.
Yes, first I wanted to address one of the questions I saw in the chat box. Do rootstocks have any effect on that? And the answer is absolutely. This is the plot or the post link you're looking at in the foreground is one of the accessions to the rootstock trial we had at Becker Vineyard in Gillespie County. And the reason there's no vines there is because they were killed by cold, whereas vines grafted on specific rootstocks actually had increased hardiness. Another thing I wanted to point out is you talked about the browning tissue here. A lot of this that you're seeing around these primary buds, the buds are alive, but this is compressed leaf tissue. And many times people, when you have cold injury, you'll see the shoots come out looking tattered. And the reason for that is because this mesophyll has indeed been damaged. And so you'll see holes in the leaves, serrated edges, a little more damage than you expect. You go, well, what happened? Was it hail or what? No, actually, that was cold injury that caused that tissue compromised. So what can we do? If you, first thing I would do is assess, do you have hardwood injury? Do you have just bud injury? If you have bud injury, you can make adjustments with your pruning levels, as Justin mentioned. But if you've got hard tissue damage, I'd say go ahead and prune vines as you would, perhaps leaving more buds at final pruning. Severely injured vines will need substantial care and handling to return to health, and a trellis free of debris for retraining. The other thing you may want to consider is greatly reduce nitrogen inputs if you've got serious injury. You got to think about this is that, dormant prunings is an invigorating action. So when, freeze kills a plant like that, it's like somebody taking a lopper and cutting off half your vines. It's going to want to grow to the moon. And the last thing is don't water stress your vines, because again, if there's xylem damage, you want to make, you don't want to put the vines under additional stress. Go ahead and replace injured trunks and cordons. Don't be in a big hurry to cut out affected tissue. If there's green tissue there's some conductive functional tissue, and it is doing something positive to the vine. So if you got hard tissue damage, there's really no rush. And if major tissue shows no sign of life, at some point, go ahead and cut it back and prune it to the area with green tissue. And, I've seen some of the mistakes people have made is when you cut it back like this, I'm just going to leave 2 shoots to retrain cordons. Well, what happens is as I think Justin may even alluded to earlier, they turn into bull canes, and they're neither productive nor cold hardy. So leave a number of shoots out there, train them up to the wire, get them well exposed to sunlight, and then consider your options. How a vine responds to freeze injury is dependent of the health of the vine and the carbohydrate reserves. And we really don't talk a whole lot about that here. I'm going to mention it briefly, but in terms of prevention in the future. One thing you may want to do after you've trained up several shoots, you may want to use a cane pruning system such as Pendlebogen for the conversion year until you get lateral bud break on some canes. You can lay down replacement cordons. And again, if you practice long prunings, as a lot of people do, if you simply have bud damage, you can go in and come in and leave extra buds. Instead of leaving 2 bud spurs, you can leave 3 bud spurs, and it can make up for as much as 50% bud mortality. So another good strategy to consider. And again, prevention. We did have good moisture in the hill country, and if there's a single thing you want to do to your vines if you see a major weather event like this coming, is make sure they have water, because if they don't have water, they can't move electrolytes and carbohydrates in and out of cellular tissue, and it's going to exacerbate freeze injury. So the things you can do is remember that Justin talked about carbohydrates as being the antifreeze mechanism of vine. Well, you want to develop the concept of a carbohydrate bank. And the only way you put carbohydrates in the bank is through photosynthesis. The way you withdraw it is either through foliage, metabolic function, cane maturation, respiration, but primarily crop. So you will see differences in bud mortality based on cropping level. So that's pretty much what I have. And I guess we're open to questions.
Jim, there's a question for you since you were talking about nutrition. So Curtis asked, early in the season, would you suggest a balanced fertilizer such as 20-20-20 rather than high nitrogen?
No, I would apply fertilizer based on a petiole analysis. I mean, that's why we use them. I've heard some people propose the concepts of applying lots of extra potassium if you see a freeze coming. Well, number one, we typically have enough potassium in our vines anyway. Potassium deficiency is rare. And number two, how do you get it into the vine on short notice? And the answer is you don't. If you're running 1.5 to 2% potassium, you've got plenty, and adding additional potassium is not going to help. So phosphorus, again, potassium and phosphorus move very, very slowly. Add it if you need it, but if you don't. I would just simply cut back on the nitrogen level.
Jim, would you address fertilizing in general to damaged vines?
Again,
yeah.
Well, again, I probably wouldn't apply any fertilizer to vines early on. Again, hard freeze injury is like a large pruning cut, and the vines are going to be vigorous. You have stored nitrogen that they're going to be used, that are stored in the roots, that's used for early season metabolism. And only apply nitrogen if you start to see some deficiency, start to see yellowing of basal leaves. And again, that's where an injector comes in really handy, even for growers on the Gulf Coast. The rest of us use it for other purposes, but you can put in liquid forms of nitrogen and basically feed them with an eyedropper, just small frequent amounts of nitrogen just to keep the canopy green. But the one danger you have is excessive vigor in the regrowth. So keep adequate but not excessive water, keep adequate but not excessive nitrogen, and do a good job of weed control. And that's the best chance you've got for vine recuperation.
Great.
There are a
Jim?
couple more questions. One from Dustin Walker. This would be in the Cathedral Mountain. What about fertilizer post-harvest?
I'm a proponent of fertilizer post-harvest. Certainly if you need potassium, if your petiole analysis says you need potassium, fall is the best time to put it down, because you need the winter rains, theoretically, when we have wet winters, to move it down into the soil to make it available for the vines the following year. I also like to put on a small amount of nitrogen late fall, such as Thanksgiving. Again, one of the blessings of growing grapes in our climate is the soil doesn't freeze, and so we continue to have nutrient absorption all during the winter if we have moisture there. So I typically put it down also because I like to plant a cover crop, and it helps bring the cover crop up. But I'm talking like 10, 12 units of nitrogen, not a lot, but I would broadcast across that, at least across a mature vineyard as a granular fertilizer. That's my approach.
Thank you. We have another one, and that is from Rick Rubiano in the Valley. And his question is this: to bypass the short absorption period, would you winterize the vine later in the season to prepare for the cold season?
I guess I don't fully understand the question. The way you winterize vines is you keep the canopy healthy as long as you can in the fall. Again, it's all about a carbohydrate balance. The more carbohydrates you can produce, again, not many blessings of growing grapes in our climate, but a long post-harvest photosynthesis period, at least in the hill country. I know the high plains doesn't necessarily have that, but we're looking at, having leaves on our vines for 2.5, 3 months after harvest. And that's the best thing we can do to replace the carbohydrates in the roots, trunks, shoots, buds. That's the best antifreeze there is.
There were a couple of questions related to buds that we can address too. One had to do with, if the primary bud has been killed and the secondary bud grows this year, will the plant produce an extra bud next year? So in other words, next year we have a primary, secondary, and tertiary. And then there was another one about, is there a relationship between temperature and bud death? And that was during Pierre's talk when he was showing the different LT50s. And is there an order of death? So primary bud, then secondary. And I think Bree showed some of that data in her presentation. So that question was probably answered to some degree, that the primary buds are the most prone and sensitive. They're the most developed, and generally will often have higher water content. So they're more likely to freeze. And that's what Bree showed in her information. She also showed that differed by variety. And then to that first question about the arrangement of buds and production of new buds in the following seasons, I would add to that, every node, everywhere a leaf attaches, you have a new compound bud that's produced every year. And so buried within the bark are primary or secondary and tertiary buds that stayed latent. So they never broke because they didn't need to. They stay alive and they get buried inside the base of the vines. And that's where those shoots come from when we see damage to the wood, whether it's the cordons or the trunks. When you see it bush out, those are those old secondary and tertiary buds. They're not adventitious or buds that are just produced in response. Those are old secondary and tertiaries there. So yes, the vine does produce insurance. It produces additional buds in the following seasons.
I do want to note that even on those varieties I showed that fared really well, that, had really low mortality. If I was just, a lot of that was just focused on primary bud mortality. And even in those that were completely healthy primaries, as it was shown before, you can have secondary mortality. And I did see a good deal of that. The primary being the most fruitful. That was what the big focus was for this data.
Yeah, and I would add to that too. In the Gulf Coast, there were Blanc de Bois in particular. It was much more damaged than Black Spanish. But Fran and I visited about a dozen vineyards, and they fared from 50% primary bud loss to 100%. And especially in those vineyards that were had a high degree of damage, the secondaries and in a lot of cases even the tertiary buds were dead as well. And it's worth noting that there is a baseline level of death that normally occurs in the primaries. So it wouldn't be uncommon even in a season where you wouldn't anticipate any damage to see a low degree, less than 10% loss to the primary buds.
Hey, I wanted to add our observation of, downy mildew in Black Spanish is pretty horrendous. And vines with heavy downy mildew that lost their canopy, they did not fare well at all. Sorry to say. So keep up your disease management.
There was another question there were two, and perhaps Dr. Shiner could answer the first and then Jim could answer the second. The first question from a grower was, would frost fans or some sort of frost technology that are commonly used for spring frost, would that have been effective in this scenario that we all saw?
So I would say it depends what day, because if we're talking about fans, that's for radiational frost events when it's still and the heat radiates into the atmosphere and you mix the warmer air that's up high with the lower air, the cooler air on the ground. But we had advective conditions where you have a lot of wind, the fans would do no good. You might actually tear up your fan, turning it on. And there's no benefit because the air is already thoroughly mixed. So yes and no, it depends on the weather conditions at the time for that type of technology. And even if you were generating heat as well, if you had some sort of heaters with wind, it would displace the heat and move it out of the vineyard. So I guess in summary, yes, they can be effective under those radiational frost conditions. I mean, even if it's wintertime, it could still potentially raise the temperature.
Okay, great. And there was another question, and Jim kind of talked about it in the chat already, but what should be done when you're, if you are checking cordons or trunks and you're making wounds? Jim, should they go and spray or cover wounds that they're making, or even with pruning and that kind of thing?
I carry a roll of budding tape with me, budding tying tape. And when I make a cut, I typically try and put the bark back down and just wrap it up like you would a bud union. And it just keeps pathogens out and the trunk can easily heal, or the cordon.
Okay, great. And Jim, there was another question. If you have severe damage and you have a green shoot, that's your scion coming up if it's grafted, is top working recommended? And if so, when does that need to be done?
Well, the question is do you have is the scion still alive?
I'm sorry.
And if it is, yeah, well, the rootstock, well, that's a giant pain in the neck. I guess if you have half a dozen vines or a dozen vines and you want to top work them, sure, go ahead. But if you're talking about blocks, acres of vines, there are crews in the world that do top working like that, but they're typically top working relatively mature trunks. If you've got a rootstock sucker, you probably got 30 rootstock suckers, and which one do you choose? If it was me, I'd pull it up and replant the vineyard. But I guess it just depends on how severe the damage is.
I just wanted to say one thing because I forgot to mention it earlier, is make sure your crew knows the difference between a rootstock sucker and your fruiting variety. So if you're retraining, in other words, if you're going to retrain a trunk, make sure that they know the difference. The leaves will look different, but in cool climates, New York State, spent some time up there, and it wasn't uncommon to see a rootstock trunk that accidentally got retrained instead of the fruiting variety.
Prune normally have low crop and have a vine that's easy to address the following year.
Will there be any changes in disease pressure this season because of the extra cold snap? Yeah, Jim, take it.
I don't think so. I mean, the one disease that potentially could be changed would be powdery mildew. But we typically have cold enough temperatures that powdery mildew spores and the buds are killed anyway. That primary infection comes from Clostridium on the bark, and they are not affected by cold temperatures. So I'd say not so much. The one thing that has been brought up is in areas where you have Pearson's disease pressure, this event probably knocked the heck out of the sharpshooter population. So that's a good thing. I don't think that we can count on this kind of cold weather to necessarily be curative of previous infections. But if there's one bright side to it, I think it probably hammered sharpshooters.
JC has put a survey in the chat box. If y'all would please give us your feedback. We need that. We look at it and we appreciate it. And some of it has to do with letting us know what you have experienced in your vineyard. Since this was a big format, we couldn't talk to you directly. So please take a moment and fill that out.